One of the things that Pope Francis emphasizes in the section on national and local policies is the importance of um, local action and local activity, which is really significant since he emphasizes it as not only as being important as in itself, but as sort of defining, providing a sense of morals and ethics
Mhm.
to human activity. Um, so I thought that that was extremely important, and he also implies in many ways that change begins um, from the bottom up
Mhm.
and almost never comes from the top down.
Yeah.
I saw a video with a priest from the Archdiocese of San Diego, and he quoted Margaret Mead. Does everyone know who Margaret Mead was?
Mm-mm.
She's a very famous anthropologist.
Oh.
I forget, she did her major studies of a tribal people in the Pacific Islands.
Uh-huh.
And
Pacific Island.
she also, although my advisor when I was at Columbia in history was a
Yeah.
historian, since he was um, had a um, a conflict-ridden relationship with all of the other people in history. Margaret Mead was his advisor, even though she was an anthropologist. Uh, so, in any case, she said, "Don't think your small group can do nothing. It's
Yeah.
the
Oh,
only
yeah.
group. It's the only group that ever has."
Yeah.
So,
That's really true.
right. Uh, so change and activism begins with a small group and spreads outward.
Do,
So
do you know which island in the Pacific that he did the study?
no, no.
Because there is in the Philippines there is the island of Mindanao. There
Uh-huh.
is some indigenous people there, which is they call it Igorot. Well, they don't have any. Well, their clothes is only the G-string, and the lady had the. It's just like they don't dress like normal people,
Yeah,
and they're still there up to this time. Yeah, they're still there. Yeah, so I was wondering
yeah.
if she went to that place. Yeah.
Now, her major, her at least her doctoral dissertation it was published as a book eventually.
Uh-huh.
It was about Samoa. It was called The Coming of Age of Samoa in Samoa.
Oh, okay, okay. Well,
Um,
that's not too far away from the Philippines, Hawaii.
no, that's not too far
Yeah,
away from the
yeah,
Philippines.
yeah, yeah. I was just wondering. Yeah, because those people cannot come down to the city because people will make fun of them and say things like I don't know, but they're not accepted, in other words.
Yeah, yeah. She also studied Papua New Guinea.
Oh, see the Papa, the way they dress is the same as the one I'm talking about.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly like that.
Yeah. There's a there's a Wikipedia article about
Yeah.
her, and I've pasted the
Okay. Oh, that would
link
be, yeah.
into the chat
Okay.
window.
Yeah.
I read the book a long, long time ago, but I don't actually remember it. And she was really a major, influence in cultural anthropology. She was really the dominant uh, cultural anthropologist of her
Yeah.
generation. So were there anyone have particular thoughts or comments or things they wanted to discuss from this chapter?
Well, this 189, page 136 on the
Oh,
book, they're talking about saying politics must not be subject to the economy, nor should the economy be subject to the dictates of the efficiency-driven paradigm of technocracy. Technocracy.
technocracy.
Technocracy, yeah. So, what does that mean, really?
Well, um, we talked about the the technological paradigm
Yeah,
earlier that you know the productive process and the economy aims at achieving greater productivity, greater use of machinery, whatever, and
yeah,
that sort of drives the economy. The economy typically drives politics.
hmm
You know,
Oh,
both
yeah, a lot.
in a whole number of ways. One of the major ways the Pope Francis makes the argument that because because large corporations are multinational, because large corporations are multinational, because they're multinational conglomerates,
Right.
they really exist independently of the nation state. And in some sense, they have more power than the nation state.
Wow.
That's that 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 that's kind of a factor that we don't typically recognize. I mean, it's been emphasized particularly by Marxist economists for the last 70 or 80 years. But we tend to view corporations in a national framework, right? Like so, uh, Toyotas are Japanese cars, right?
Yeah,
And so if you buy American or you believe in buying American, you shouldn't buy a Toyota. But most Toyota cars are manufactured either in the US or Mexico. So
yeah,
they're in some sense American, but the basic thing is that the corporation itself is multinational. It may be headquartered in Japan, but it's a worldwide corporation. The same thing, is true of Ford Motor Company. It may be headquartered in the Detroit suburbs, but it's a multinational corporation, and so they exist independently of the nation state, and they're capable of wielding power on the nation state and of being fairly unresponsive to an individual nation state. So that's one thing. The second link between economics and politics, at least it's less true outside of the United States, or at least it's less true in Western Europe,
mhm,
but or at least it's less true in Western Europe, but it's certainly true in the United States that people tend to vote their pocketbooks. We've discussed this before. So
right. Yeah,
if you tend to vote for as a presidential candidate, you tend to vote for the candidate, the incumbent, who has presided over economic prosperity. And if the incumbent hasn't presided over economic prosperity, you tend to vote against him. But all of this occurs independently of, the policies or the the morality or anything else of the candidate you're voting for. So the argument is that had Trump not completely bungled the coronavirus response
Mhm.
and had not and so had not the economy been undermined, he might have won.
Yeah.
And yet he's a man of absolutely nothing resembling what anyone could identify as human ethics and human morality. His sole principles involved his own self-aggrandizement, his own wealth, and his own power. And so that's a real issue, that people tend to vote what's good for their immediate economic self-interest, which means an inability to see beyond immediate self-interest,
Well,
and an inability to look for um, anything, an inability to infuse any sense of ethics or morality into, a debate, and also an inability to care about the future or about future generations, so that everything becomes sacrificed to, the current state of things. If I'm doing well now,
yeah,
that's good.
that's all it counts. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's sad. That
And then the problem is, of course, that that's also the ethics of capitalism. What counts
yeah,
is the ability to make a profit now, and capitalism in that sense is extremely short-sighted. Capitalism, you know, aims at profit now and hopes that it can increase production to produce more profit.
the
But then the
profit.
problem is that that increase of production comes at the expense of of environmental and human degradation.
Yeah. But,
So so that's sort of what. So that there was. I
I
saw
know.
an interesting statistic today.
How many plus?
The poorest half of the world's population, so I think at this point that's about 4 billion people or 3.5 billion people,
Mm.
own collectively $408 billion. So that's an average of about $100 per person. The richest 8 people in the world own $426 billion.
Oh,
So 8 people are richer than half of the world's population.
yeah. Oh my goodness.
If we look at, the disparity in wealth in the United States, it's not as that dramatic, although of course it's this dramatic on a world scale because it's, includes the third world and extremely poor countries. But the disparity in wealth has been increasing, and and in the United States, and is really, I mean, the disparity in wealth, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people in the United States is now greater than it ever has been in American history. And
Oh,
then,
really? What what was the reason for that?
um, well, a major, uh, partly, it's sort of, I mean, some of the reason for wealth is, simply the multiplication of capital and wealth in the hands of those who are already wealthy through, investments
Uh-huh.
and investment in the stock market and whatever. But also a major reason, especially from the time of Reagan on, has been U.S. government fiscal policy and tax policy. Reagan practiced trickle down economics. So, tax advantages were given to the rich. And the
Yeah.
assumption is that they would trickle down to the poor. Basically, the same policy has been followed by all Republican presidents except Trump.
Mm.
Um, Carter, I mean, not both Carter and Clinton did little to reverse the trend. Obama did change taxation a bit to favor the poor, but then Trump's policy um, was to use a huge tax reduction, especially for the rich, but most particularly for corporations,
Yeah. Big
under the
corporation.
assumption, which is completely unfounded and has never been. I mean, it's been disproven over and over and over again that a huge drop in the taxation of corporations, particularly, would prompt investment, which would generate greater income and bring in more in taxes than the tax cut. But that that has never ever worked. It was demonstrably false, and as a result, the U.S. government deficit, even without the uh, coronavirus stimulus packages,
Mm.
has reached alarming
Mm.
levels
You
under
do you
Trump.
think that it will happen in the future that they will decrease the tax for the poor and make all these corporation or the big businesses pay more taxes so we could probably, I don't know, I was thinking about that, maybe the poor will not become poorer. you know,
I mean,
like middle class.
in the United, the problem in the United States is that in some peculiar way, there's and among many, including many of the poor,
Yeah.
there's a real defense of the rich. So remember a couple of years ago there was the amendment to introduce an income tax in
Yeah.
Washington State.
Right. Yeah.
So the amendment was written by Bill Gates's father,
Oh.
and the amendment was to introduce an income tax on like the top. I forget the precise numbers, but it was to introduce an income tax on like the top 5 or 10% of uh, the of people of incomes,
Uh,
right? So 90% or 95% wouldn't be taxed, and the measure failed rather by an enormous vote because everyone was concerned they'd be taxed.
right.
But
Yeah.
that makes no sense and would have required a new amendment.
Yeah.
So
You know,
so so but
tax.
that's consistently in America. That's consistently sort of was a real problem. We have a rich history of selling our soul to the devil.
Yeah, we pay taxes on everything. Like, for example, unemployment. They shouldn't be taxing unemployment. For the
Right,
reason why unemployment check is to help the person that didn't have a job, right? And
right.
you still have to pay tax on
You
that.
still have to pay taxes, right? Right.
Yeah,
And the shocking thing is that unemployment is such a pittance.
yeah,
And if you're a near minimum wage worker, with minimum wage not paying enough to survive,
Yeah.
then unemployment certainly doesn't pay enough to survive. And then
No.
you get
Not
taxed on
really.
that.
Yeah. And then they ask you, do you want to take the tax out, right on the bat, like what, 20%, 10%, this is unemployment now, but you need all this money.
Yeah.
So you said no.
So technology dominates the economy, and then that in turn dominates politics.
Yeah, they're
So,
always coincide together.
yeah. And then, in America, we're also seeing the, sort of very disturbing trend that um, politics dominates politics with absolutely no sense of anything resembling ethics or morality. And so we're seeing that really strongly from the Republican Party, which stands, if you can try to identify principles that they stand for, uh, there are none other than raw power. Um, so the Republican Party used to be a party of fiscal responsibility and a balanced budget, right? Which is a principle, whether you, sort of agree with it or not. I didn't particularly, but I also didn't, agree with wild spending.
Mhm.
Under Trump, they engaged in wild spending. Um, and now they're back to fiscal responsibility only because they're out of power.
Yeah,
That, there are no ethics and there's no morality there. And they're continuing to emphasize that the election was stolen
exactly.
and
They have not stopped thinking that. Yeah,
try to curtail voting rights, especially the voting rights of people of color. They argued that every vote should count at the same time that they tried to throw out the votes of entire states.
Mm. Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and tried to emphasize election fraud when often they were probably the perpetrators of the fraud. So no principle, power for itself. So in either of those cases, where power as its own, as an end in itself, and where technology dominates the economy, which drives politics,
Yeah.
we end up with environmental degradation, with oppression of the poor,
Oh,
with a worsening of the current situation rather than an improvement. So, where do we break out of it?
well, it should start from the higher up, but like you said, we probably never happen.
Yeah, we
Right?
can.
Yeah, because little people, all this little group. I mean, they can do only so much, but it's the higher up is probably more powerful.
We have
So
to start teaching our kids from young.
yeah, we should teach our kids to be a president of the United States.
Right? That's one thing.
Yeah. So
Um,
it's, I think it's getting worse than getting better. You know, I don't care who the president is. They have their own agenda. Each one of these presidents have their own agenda.
yeah, it is getting
Yeah,
worse.
yeah. It's not
Um,
for the people. Yeah.
the local movements are also important. We see
We
them.
have a lot of local movements right now, and it's not necessarily positive.
No, no, it's not necessarily positive. Um, no, I mean, yeah, I mean the major. Well, I mean,
There is there is a movement I saw on TV, cleaning the lake. So they have a boat, and
uh-huh,
they're collecting all this plastic, whatever's in the in the lake.
right,
They make use out of that. So I mean, there are only like 3 or 4 of them in this group. I don't know if they're gonna recruit some more people to do that. I think that's the start. Cleaning the lake from all of this debris that's coming out. People throwing and doesn't care. You know,
yeah,
you see the lake is beautiful, and then you see all this debris floating around.
yeah, 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 yeah. The yeah, yeah. I mean, a big problem is that the local movements that we see are most commonly the loudest, and at this point, you
Yeah,
know, they tend to be the local movements spawned by um, internet disinformation and conspiracy theories.
oh,
Uh, but at the same time, underneath all of the, sort of noise, there's also, you know, small groups working together to do things. I mean, so
yeah,
cleaning the lake is a good example. I
yeah.
mean, you know, I
Yeah,
mean,
they advertised it. They said, "Help us." That's
mhm,
what they're picking up the step, and then while they're doing that, they said it will be good if somebody will help us do the same thing. So
right.
it's a good advertising. Yeah,
Hmm. And there are all sorts of local grassroots organizations devoted to, specific causes.
right. Yeah,
Like WAML, the organization that I've gotten my Yuma and Yiska and then Zena then from,
yeah,
they rescue Malamutes and
yeah,
Malamute
yeah,
mixes that you know animal abuse organizations that
yeah,
rescue abused animals are extremely important. Organizations that press for environmental change or an extension of recycling or things of that sort are important, really important. It it has to start somewhere,
yeah,
and for each of us, it has to start somewhere with us.
yeah,
Um, and the I think the important thing is, have we done what we're able to do to try to drive change and to try to bring, you know, cause progressive change in defense of both our planet and the poor. Um, and also, have we tried to, sort of infuse a sense of morality and ethics into the debate, and especially to, the problem is that in our in our own world, lies are disguised in the form of moral and ethical behavior,
mhm,
and and that's particularly the case, with global warming. It's particularly the case with exploitation of the poor. It's particularly the case with racism. It's particularly the case with all of the things that are used to demean people and that are used to destroy our world, that they're always expressed as doing good. And so we lift all the environmental restraints, and we, allow this wanton pollution of the water and the
Yeah.
air because industry will grow and it'll create more jobs. Uh, Everybody is going to pay for those jobs. There's a huge cost. The the cost of just the medical cost of treatment of disease caused by environmental degradation is enormous. The loss of life caused by air pollution and by water pollution is enormous. The degradation of our environment, the loss of wildlife, all of those are just enormous costs. And yet that's phrased as, being good. So, so even today in America, particularly, it's very easy to not believe in climate. Many people don't believe in climate change,
Yeah.
even though, we discussed this the first time, there really is no scientific debate. It's very clear that the climate is changing and that change is largely due to human activity.
Yeah.
But following there doesn't appear to be any consensus. If you look at the debate on the internet, where there is no debate really, except that climate change deniers are much more public with their denial than the scientific community as a whole, and they're also much less qualified.
But there's a lot of sign all around us, like Texas, for example. They haven't had a flood for like 100 years. And then Colorado right now is snowing. He said this is the first snow like this in in 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right,
science is all over around us. I don't know why
right.
people get.
Big trucks with chains on their wheels are all abandoned at the side of the road right now.
Oh really?
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah.
Right,
Hmm.
right. Yeah, but then, the problem is that, so then there are a number of arguments there. The first is that if it's global warming, how come it's snowing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Although, the reality, the actual argument behind global warming isn't that there aren't cold weather
Yeah.
uh, periods or even extreme cold or more snow. It's that weather is more extreme while there's a general warming. So so say in my hometown there are still extreme periods of snow,
Yeah.
but if you look at annual snowfall, on an average,
Yeah.
Diminished.
a moving a moving average over my lifetime, the average annual snowfall is down by about 70 inches a year.
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's staggering. It's down by about 33%.
what
That,
about the Antarctica melting?
yeah.
Some, yeah.
Actually, I looked at saw in the local newspaper from my hometown that the ski hills were closing, and
Not enough snow.
it's only mid-March. Ordinarily, they wouldn't close until probably the first week in April,
Yeah.
and snow wouldn't be melted until mid-April. And it's still there will probably still be patches in early May. So there's clearly a change, but we tend to look at a particular incident and draw conclusions from it.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And secondly, clearly weather patterns are becoming more violent. I mean, we're seeing more tropical storms. We're seeing worse tropical storms. We're seeing more winter storms. We're seeing worse winter storms. We're we're seeing rising sea levels. Um, we're seeing all of these really catastrophic signs.
Yeah.
And of course, also I watched. I didn't. I didn't watch it all because
Which
it
one?
was. It was. I forget. It was. Oh my goodness, what is his name? There was an evangelical preacher named John Hagee. So his son has, a podcast type of thing. So he addressed global warming. It's of course, global warming is a fake. These are all signs that Jesus is coming, as Matthew says in chapter 25. I especially like that because even if you think Matthew said it, it would have been in chapter 24.
Oh, they have the different Bible.
Chapter 25 is only about the need to be prepared, and
Yeah.
and it has no signs, right? The signs are listed in chapter 12, except that there's signs for the destruction of the temple, not for the second coming. But even given that misinterpretation, he's got the wrong chapter. So it's like just striking.
So maybe all their followers believing that.
Oh yeah, very, very, very much so. Very much
Yeah.
so. Global warming is a hoax, and all of these changes are simply signs that Christ is coming again.
The second coming.
Whatever, what conclusion did they have about the ice age and things like that, and the disappearance of dinosaurs? And I mean, have they got any scientific reasoning for shifts in climate other than people?
Um,
Because what's natural and what isn't is what I'm trying to say.
right. The I mean, shifts in climate occur naturally anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but the problem is that our shifts in climate, I mean, so, we discussed in the first class scientific research on greenhouse gas effects and its effect, which has been known for the last century and a half. So that seems to be most. So basically, I mean, our climate is still, in its current form, is still fairly young.
Mm.
And so, you wouldn't expect particularly dramatic change yet. And yet there is dramatic change, and there is the research into the greenhouse gas effect. And we do produce huge amounts of greenhouse gases, far beyond the capacity of the natural environment to cleanse itself and purge itself of them. And that situation is worsening as we deplete the forests. And so it seems really incontrovertible that the effect of this series of changes is almost exclusively man-made. And then in terms of the dissenting school, I mean, I'm not actually sure. There's one school of thought that the dinosaurs are a hoax
What?
because the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
They,
So,
no, because they found a bone of dinosaur.
oh, they found very many bones,
Yeah,
but I mean, yeah, I mean, nevertheless, the problem is that we've become, well, the problem is that data has become irrelevant, or, what is, you know, what do you use as data? So for many Christians, particularly those who believe in biblical literalism, the Bible is the only data you need, right?
yeah.
And so, if you extrapolate
I don't think
from,
God told us that.
no, no, I mean, it's completely, um, I mean, I mean, what's tragic about it, first of all, I mean, it discredits Christianity. I mean, it makes Christianity and Christians into a joke and a laughing stock, and quite just rightly. I mean, it's disgraceful. The second thing, is that so God is infinite, right? God is incomprehensible and unknowable. God is the God of the possible and the God of the impossible. God, all things are possible for God. And so when we take this, you know, crippled conception of the Bible, we transform God into someone who's a limited version of ourselves, less than ourselves. And that's, I mean, I find that, you know, the most outrageous thing. There's like no, I mean, so if we look at, the fathers, they approached God with imagination, by which I mean they didn't, read the Bible and come up with this stupidity.
Yeah.
They tried to contemplate the divine. And that drove them both to, sort of to develop profound insight into the things of God, and also to develop profound insight into the human condition. So, you encounter wisdom from the fathers and not stupidities. But, when you read this kind of biblical literalist stuff, it's like, this is stupid. I mean, why? I mean, I don't even know why anyone would want to believe it. It's sort of like, why? It's like God as small as we are? Do we serve a God who's as incompetent, inept, and bungling as we are? One would hope not. I mean, we don't, obviously, but it makes a pathetic, it's a pathetic revelation of God. And for any non-believer, to look at this, do you want to believe in, this being this being who is, evil, this being who can't do anything right, this being who completely lacks foresight, this being that's stupid? Do you want to believe in that? Is that where you place your hope? No, of course you don't want to place your hope there. Who would? And yet, here we have it. But, and so, the Bible itself is data, but the Bible is intended to reveal God in a, sort of a deep way, not in this kind of superficial ways. Like, Genesis story isn't that God created the world in 7 days and that's it. What does that mean? What does the creation story mean? And it's often been pointed out, it has nothing to do with Darwinism. It has something to do with the context within which the story was developed against the cultures that had similar creation stories. That God is a God of order. God is a God who created things out of good. That God created things out of his own goodness to reflect his own goodness, as opposed to creating things out of conflict and chaos. And then seven, of course, I mean, the 7 days is, figurative. It's not a literal 7 days of creation.
Right.
Seven is the number of divine completion. God created a perfect universe. And so it's like this literalism just misses the point. So, that's one problem. And then we have, all of the conspiracy theory stuff abounding on the internet, which also is,
I don't even look at internet, that stuff like that. Just yeah. There's so many junk,
there's so
garbage.
much junk. I mean, the sad thing is that there's also an enormous wealth of good stuff on the internet,
Yeah.
an enormous wealth of
How
real
do you
information.
decipher what's true and what's not? And why should somebody else decipher what's true and what's not?
I mean, it's not that hard. You just, have to be careful about what you look at. There's
Right.
Right,
yeah, but
right.
um but yeah, I mean, the just, the I mean, most of the stuff that isn't true is fairly incredible. Like, running these slavery rings out of pizza parlors.
Oh,
Really?
oh my goodness.
And the whole thing about the deep state. The deep state is the professional bureaucracy. It's, one can argue that um, it represents the interests of the rich, but nevertheless, it also, I mean, it is the professional bureaucracy, and it does have an ethos of public service and some kind of notion of trying to serve the common good, even if it does that by balancing or favoring the interests of the wealthy. But, sort of getting rid of it doesn't do anything other than favor the wealthy, because it, removes the kind of the institution that makes the state appear as if it exists above social and economic interests. So it removes the sort of buffer that, at least to some degree, mitigates the condition of the poor and the poorest, and introduces some kind of element of a principle of ethics into the process. And so that just removes it entirely. That's no solution at all. So it's crazy.
Well, the only thing we have to be very selective of what we
Right.
see and hear, and then examine it before we draw conclusion. and more information. I
Right.
think maybe the people they just hear it and read it and believe it without you know checking it out. Get more information. Why is this happening?
Hmm.
What's the cause?
Right.
So yeah,
What are the costs?
yeah,
Yeah.
how it started. Yeah.
In the in the last part, Pope Francis talks about science, and last section is religions in dialogue with science. And it's sort of interesting that he largely, I mean, he's discussed the relationship between science and religion earlier, that
Yeah.
particularly as Catholics, we should be a people who believe in science, that the relationship between Catholicism and science has traditionally been a close one. But here he largely skips that. He doesn't really mention that at all. I mean, he says that science itself is unable to solve the world's problems. I mean, in fact, that's certainly true. Science, in many ways, has been the creator of the world's problems. Science has gotten us to the point that we are at, and is certainly not capable of, it, itself is not capable of leading us away, or of solving the problem in any way. So he notes that the majority of the world's population are believers in some form.
Mm.
So the majority of the world's population, probably the overwhelming majority of the world's population, believe in a god or gods. I mean, in the case of Hinduism, there's obviously pantheism, and then most of the world's religions are monotheistic. But
Buddhism. Yeah.
but the idea is, so his contention there is that we can join with all people of faith, as part of a common dialogue, to inject ethics and morality into the debate. And so, I mean, this is very much like, the role of the Vatican Academy of Sciences, aside from its work in astronomy, um, and astrophysics, that as people who believe, as religious people, that we can play a major role in bringing ethics and morality into, the debate about our common home. So um, that's, I mean, I think on the one hand he's, correct. On the other hand, there are also huge obstacles there.
Hmm.
Yeah, talking about religion, there's a couple of people from our parish that moved to a church that had Latin mass. What do you think about that?
That has what?
Latin
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 Latin mass.
mass.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up with Latin mass, but I didn't like it because I don't understand it. I don't
Yeah,
understand. So I'm glad that when the English came,
yeah. I
there's
mean, I um, I mean, I sort of try not to have such an adverse reaction,
yeah.
but I'm not a big fan. I mean, I think that, so, there's this view that it's the traditional
Yeah.
mass.
And then that way, if you're in a different country, you understand what they're saying because
Well, the problem is, most of the people who go to Latin mass don't understand Latin,
Yeah. They have
and
they have a conversion. Like
there's a second problem, that I mean, so the problem is, what is tradition? So Latin was not the
no.
language of the mass for most people for most of the history of Christianity.
well,
Latin was not
for
even,
Europe, though, a lot of languages are Latin based, right?
yeah, but even so, they, weren't, the mass wasn't, even in the Western church, the mass wasn't necessarily in Latin,
Mm.
Well, Jesus
so
himself doesn't speak Latin. He speaks Greek
Jesus,
and Aramaic.
Jesus spoke Aramaic.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and and, and Greek, right?
No, probably
Yeah.
just Aramaic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So, where is this people saying, well, it's a traditional? Come on,
well,
traditional.
Latin emerged as the sole language in the Middle Ages,
Okay.
and so that's the problem with tradition. That we tend to
Get it?
see tradition as a thing, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the tradition, but
Right.
tradition isn't, a thing or a state or an object. Tradition is a living being in some sense. I mean,
Wasn't in
tradition is
existence.
dynamic. Tradition can't be frozen. You can
Yeah.
never go back to some traditional state because history doesn't work that way. And the Christian conception of history doesn't work that way either. History is dynamic, things change. So the important thing is, how do you preserve tradition in the midst of a changing world? Where, at what point have you broken with tradition, and at what point have you preserved tradition? And the fact is that, whether you celebrate Mass in the same language or not has very little to do with those issues. I
Yeah.
mean, most fundamentally, the reason that that there is the reason that there are words in a Mass is that so those attending the Mass can hear the words.
Well,
Right?
I think because Europe, a lot of Europe is Latin based, it's fine for them to have Latin masses
Well,
Yeah. Not
because
they're they're still not going to understand most of the Latin anyway.
yeah.
Because it's kind of, I mean, it's really fundamentally, I mean,
because I mean I
English,
didn't take Latin in school in high school in Canada, but Lloyd did. Lloyd took
yeah,
Latin and
I
French,
did, I did too.
and he did too. So there are places where they still teach Latin,
Yeah,
and they
unfortunately,
probably do that in Europe.
I don't know. I would, sort of hope so, but I suspect that Europe is probably subject to. I mean, the problem here is that classic education has really gone by the wayside, and the focus is on education as um, a preparation for making money.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the emphasis on learning is kind of gone, and the emphasis on practical utility that you'll derive. So Spanish is emphasized above all because there are so many Spanish speakers.
Yeah. It's self.
French
It's
French is
self-contained. Yeah. Not.
French is de-emphasized, and Latin has disappeared in many places because nobody speaks it. And so there's this emphasis on the immediate utility, and that emphasis really, and similarly in colleges and universities, there's a sort of a de-emphasis on kind of liberal arts and on classical studies in favor of things that, say, in political science, similarly, an emphasis on politics and international politics, and a de-emphasis on, say, political theory. Um, so, there's a de-emphasis on analysis and thought, and an emphasis on practically what you're going to get out of it. But in terms of there's a sufficient, English is also, although it has a major Anglo-Saxon influence, is also a Romance language. Since there's also the other heavy and really major influence over the Anglo-Saxon is the Norman influence. So that's French.
Yeah.
But even so, although that helps you understand Latin, there's a sufficient gap between Latin and English and Latin and French and Latin and Spanish that if you're a native French or English Spanish speaker, you're still not going to understand Latin very well,
Yeah.
if at all. So 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 the problem is that the most important thing in the mass is that we listen to the mass, that understanding the mass is an important component, is an important part of our participating, and that's critical to worshiping God. If you're going to listen to mass in a language that you don't understand, your
Yeah.
participation is going to be different and oftentimes very limited.
Yeah.
I have
And
a question about seminarians though. Do they still they still have to learn have to learn the Latin, right?
Yeah, I think so.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, if you learn Latin, I mean, if you go to Latin Mass and you understand Latin, I can understand that. Our faith is dynamic, and we always have to, sort of consider that it changes, that it's undergone enormous changes over time, and yet in that change, there's been enormous continuity. Um, and in many ways, looking at, the pre-Vatican II period, the what was most troubling about it is that fundamentally we were watching the priest celebrate the mass, and we were spectators.
Mhm.
We're called on not to be there.
But I think we still have to. I think we still. I mean, I think the masses that are being held in Latin, I think that's just an option for people who want it.
Right.
But I don't think that's a problem.
Well, I
For
think, I mean,
people
it's
who
a
want
problem, to the extent that it's tied to this kind of extreme conservatism, that
Yeah.
Vatican II was, a completely wrong step, that it's often tied to, rejection of Pope Francis in particular, and often, the complete line of popes, starting with Pope John the 23rd. And also, with, in many ways, this notion of Catholicism as sort of distinct and sort of separate. I mean, a while ago, I looked at, this critique of Pope Francis from, some traditionalist Catholics, and so at one point he he apologized to, I think, the Coptic bishops or one of the sets of bishops from one of the 5 Eastern Occidental or Oriental Orthodox churches. And there was general outrage that, the Catholic Pope would apologize to these dirtbags. A problem, is that, traditionalist Catholics are very,
Eccentric.
they're, well, it's not only eccentric, when Putin visited the Vatican, I think it was last year, it may have been the year before that,
Okay.
there was an in the conservative Italian Catholic press, there was an enormous amount of, sort of editorializing about how looking at Putin, sort of wistfully and wishing that the Pope could be as pontifical as Putin.
Okay.
But, Putin is a tyrant. There's nothing pontifical about him.
Yeah.
And there's nothing holy about him. And
So they want to treat him like the Pope, huh?
yeah, they wish the Pope was like him. I mean, certainly, I'm really, there's not much to say. Pope Francis is, I think, really an exemplary Pope.
Yeah.
He's just both.
I'm sure he raised all the, uh, you know, cons and pros and cons before he decided not to canonize that person.
Right.
They study it first. He's a very smart man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah. So unfortunately, as Christians, we have a great deal of work to do.
Yeah.
to infuse Christian ethics and morality into the debate. But
Yeah, it was in 2019. It was
it was,
the
yeah,
summer of 2019.
yeah. It's yeah. It's hard to, yeah. In some sense, it's almost like the world had stopped last March.
Yeah.
So, so that time hasn't really existed, and everything has fallen off of the face of the earth.
Oh boy. Okay.
Well, but so I think the lesson here, is that change has to begin with us individually and locally, and that it's important, that change happen. So I think it's important that as Catholics, we
Yeah.
be a voice, that we be a voice for future generations, that we be a voice for the poor, that we be a voice for the oppressed, that we be a voice for the planet, that we be a voice for endangered species, that we be a voice for, clean air and clean water.
Mhm.
We need to stop soon, but there was another interesting statistic. So 70% of the is it 70% of the earth is water.
Mhm.
Of that, only 3% of the water is potable. Of that 3%, 70% is used for agriculture, 20% is used for industry, and only 10% is used for drinking or for human consumption. And yet, water is, a critical life-giving substance. Without it, no being can survive. And unfortunately, in many cases, water is being grossly misused, and also in many areas grossly polluted. But so we have to be a voice, and we have to become activists